All rise, veuillez vous lever. Please be seated. Veuillez vous asseoir.
Still good morning, Mr. Knops, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President, Your Honors. Good morning. We will continue with the alleged contribution, Mr. ssona. We left with Kokora. Now we go into Froca. In order to have his case not totally collapse, the prosecution was also in need to construe the narrative that Bozizé intended to go back to power via military means such as allegedly Froca. Yet, to perform this exercise, in order to persuade the judges, it necessarily had to overlook again its own evidence, the evidence which was presented at trial, establishing that Froca was not a military organization, but its aim was to reach out to the international community. The protocol d'accord du Froca, if you look at the plain text, Mr. President, it's clear that it has nothing to do with a military organization. Secondly, the prosecution ignores the fact that none of its witnesses saw this document, and that even Jean-Cher Soifiot clearly stated in his email that this document was merely a draft. But in order to sustain the theory that Froca was a military organization, the prosecution needed to resort to speculation, including the testimony of Kokate, who speculated merely that Bozizé intended to go back to power via military means, which he only inferred. It was not a conclusion, it was an inference from the first Froca meeting, while acknowledging he was never part of Froca. The evidence of Kokate and P2625 with regard to the alleged intention of Mr. Bozizé was also here refuted by the most direct evidence the court could have seen in this court, namely D304720. Similarly, 1847 and 2673 prosecution witnesses were not part of Froca and didn't provide any direct information. B2328, 004 and 2926, alleged knowledge about Froca merely derives from newspaper articles. The prosecution's dubious use of the evidence in this regard is also visible in paragraph 151 of its brief concerning the trip of Poussou to New York to the UN, which Mr. Bozizé paid for as conceded by this very witness. Interesting, the prosecution claims that Poussou distanced himself from Froca upon his return because Bozizé, as this witness alleged it, decided to abandon the diplomatic solution. So, there was a diplomatic solution, as admitted by Poussou. And the rest was mere speculation of this gentleman. Now, Mr. President, I move now to the various locations in which Mr. ssona allegedly did have some contribution, starting with Gobert and the Bossangoa group. Also here, to not have his narrative totally collapsing, the prosecution needed to resort to an artificial connection between self-defense groups and the military in the Bossangoa region to the so-called inner circle. How did the prosecution try to persuade the chamber with this artificial connection? It did it simple. It did it simply by labeling the FACA and the Presidential Guard who participated in this gathering as loyal to Mr. Bozizé, para 64 of the prosecution brief, without one shred of evidence, Mr. President Jonas, without one shred of evidence in support. It's simply presumed that FACA, even Presidential Guard, would have automatically been pro-Bozizé, which perpetuates a very simplistic narrative and ignores the vast amount of evidence given by the prosecution's own witnesses who were part of the self-defense groups gathering in Bossangoa and who clearly testified before this court that they did not work for Bozizé to have him return to power and that Bozizé did not assist them. Clear evidence. The prosecution's assertion that the military were called upon to strengthen self-defense groups, paragraph 100 of this brief, in order to reinforce the impression of an invisible hand, word of the prosecution, was simply mere speculation. The court heard evidence, overwhelming evidence, showing that the FACA and the Presidential Guards were targeted by the Seleka and for this reason chose themselves to organize them for their survival. The prosecution theory lacks any evidential support for the allegation that Mr. Ngasolo was involved in the Gobert group by providing money, as asserted in the prosecution brief paragraph 135. But to further camouflage this illusory tactic, it outright distorts the evidence and relies on entirely no evidence at all. Two examples: the reliance on P0966, who was in Gobert and later joined the Bossangoa attack. The prosecution omits to say that this witness clearly indicated that money was received only after 5 December and that he had no idea who sent the money. Second, despite the obvious credibility issues with P2269, its prior recorded statement, prosecution still tries to rely on him to bolster that ssona sent money to the anti-Balaka in Gobert. But elsewhere in the brief, paragraph 226 of the prosecution, it concedes to not believing that this gentleman was ever part of the Gobert group by saying that he was amongst individuals who were deployed from Zongo to Damara and not from Gobert to Damara at the end of November 2013. And this was repeated in the PowerPoint presented to the prosecution of last Monday, slide 36. Now, what about the border? The prosecution was mindful, Mr. President, that it had no direct evidence to prove to the requisite threshold that Mr. ssona was involved in the motivation, mobilization, deployment, or equipment of elements from Douala, Yaoundé to Karumboulay, Bertoua, Bouar. So what did the prosecution do to persuade the chamber? It simply presented witnesses who were only able to provide assumptions, such as 1847. The prosecution relies also only on the examination chief of 2673, but it forgot to say that during the cross-examination, the defense was able, during that examination, to have it become clear that this gentleman had no personal knowledge of where the money came from. He changed his narrative on various occasions, and this testimony of him is simply unsafe. It also ignores the evidence, direct evidence of Mohi and WBO. In fact, apart from the proposed evidence of 1719, that was totally disqualified by Mohi and WBO, none of the reference in the prosecution brief in footnote 244 supports that Mr. ssona mobilized anyone in Douala. Mr. President, it's also here striking that the prosecution did not do what the defense did, namely to reach out to Mohi, who was, by the way, also mentioned in the prior recorded statement of 1719, not admitted through 683, by the way, But it was full aware that even the witness 1719 said, I got the number from Mohi, the number from of ssona from Mohi. So what should the prosecution do to verify this? It didn't do it. We did. We reached out to Mohi. And the result, Your Honors know what happened with Mohi in this court. Prosecution did nothing. There is no evidence, Mr. President, finally, on this issue on the border, that Mr. ssona gave ever instructions to attack Belocco in January 2014. It's absolutely telling how the prosecution completely ignores the direct evidence of D34914, who was, again, the best placed witness ever in this trial regarding the border. It turned a blind eye to the credible and enlightening evidence the court heard from D34914 on this point. It only asked the court to look at the Facebook exchanges and the statement 1719. The result would be a wrongful prosecution and conviction in light of what D34914 convincingly testified about. There's no support for the allegation that Mr. ssona ever gave Sabé in order to attack Belocco. None. No witness, no testimony. Finally, Zongo. Full well aware was the prosecution that it had no evidence to tie Mr. ssona to the alleged resistance in Zongo. But to remedy also here this flaw in the eyes of the court, it claims in its brief that ssona and Yekatom enlisted Maximo into their plan to retake power, para 70 of the brief. A baseless allegation, Mr. President, distorting again the evidence. P889, on whom the prosecution relies, actually testified that Maximo acted on his own initiative, and the PowerPoint of last month of the prosecution also showed it was Mokom alone, and Mokom alone, who was in charge of Zongo. Mr. President, Bangui. Of course, the prosecution had to rely in their theory on any tie it could artificially make to have Mr. ssona connected to the acts in Bangui in order to uphold his theory. How were they able to do so? They presented again, as the so-called smoking gun, the Besoin emails from 7 and 12 October 2013. But they ignored again the direct evidence. The person who actually sent those emails to Mr. ssona, P2843, and the point vocal in those emails, P2841. We all know that the defense examined those witnesses, like the prosecution, and they categorically refuted the narrative of the prosecution. It was a fiction. It was a virtual rebellion they created. In our closing brief, we extensively dealt with those direct testimonies of those individuals. Secondly, about Bangui, Mr. President, the prosecution had to invent another construction to evade its evidential problem with those two live witnesses. Namely, it could only started to push the limits of inference upon inference and circumstantial evidence. For instance, in the brief in para 167, it alleges that Lacoutena was in contact with two numbers from Cameroon without specifying who those phone numbers have belonged to. Given the context of that paragraph, Mr. President, the prosecution wants to imply that either of those numbers were used by Bernard Mokom. However, there is no single basis in the evidence before you for this conclusion. Elsewhere in the brief of the OTP, it argues that there are so-called similarities between the Besoin emails and the lists allegedly sent by Grémangou, and a list allegedly found on Eric Damboy's computer of military equipment. Now, Mr. President, the OTP also here asks your court simply to extrapolate beyond the reasonable limits in an attempt to show a link between these documents. But a closer look at these documents, Mr. President, Your Honors, the authenticity and the reliability of which the defense has challenged in its filings will show that they are not similar, far from similar. There's simply no link between those documents. Lastly, Mr. President, about Bangui, in a desperate attempt not to have its case fully collapsing also on Bangui, it tries, the prosecution, it tries to tie Mr. Ngai with military equipment providence after the 5th December attack. Did they succeed for this chamber? Not at all. Not at all. The OTP relies in its brief in para 265 simply on emails between Désiré Mizan and Mr. Ngai, allegedly in code language. Let us first have a look at those emails, Mr. President, and its probative value before this court. First, the identity of the interlocutor, Désiré Mizan, is far from established, and nothing on the record before this court leads to the identification of this person. Second, the prosecution failed to prove that the individual this email was forwarded is Franklin Bozizé. There's no evidence brought before this court. It's simply an assumption. Three, the meaning of Wolf GZ1 is not established. In fact, if you Google it, the first result that comes up is for sunglasses. Really, sunglasses. The prosecution assertion in this regard is therefore entirely unsupported. And lastly, fourth, even if this email was in fact referring, Mr. President, to military equipment, which we contest, the prosecution still fails to link those emails to anything tangible, to any tangible acts on the ground. There is simply no evidence that the supplies in that scenario would have been purchased, and there's no record, there's no forensic evidence of any money transfer to this extent. It might also be a phantom between people, what they thought would have been interesting. But even if they had been purchased, that materials, there's no evidence who received those supplies, to whom were they distributed, whether they were used at all on the ground, and where, what time, to what extent, with which result, let alone to use to commit a crime. No evidence of which crime these supplies contributed to in that scenario, Mr. President, when and where. Mr. Ngai role, speaking about his contribution. Also here on this topic, Mr. President, Your Honors, the prosecution was full well aware that it had no direct evidence to prove that Mr. Ngai was a recognized leader well before he became general coordinator in Bangui. But also here, they found an artificial solution. To overcome this evidential problem, Mr. President, the prosecution had to transform, what I say, transform speculation into evidence. That is actually the whole tactic of the whole case for the prosecution. If we can transform speculation into evidence, the court will believe and will buy our story. For example, the prosecutor relied on P2843 to argue that Mr. Ngai held a coordinating role prior to his return to Bangui. OTP brief para 16 and 195. However, as the court might recall, 2843 was really uncertain of the time frame when Mr. Ngai became coordinator. Similarly, 2841's evidence, cited in the same paragraph of the prosecution brief, is taken at face value, while he clearly testified, I cite, "I can't really know what happened, but the money could have been transferred via him." That were the words of 2841. And he clarified that his source was, I quote, "many politicians." P2232, on which the prosecution relies, merely deducing from the fact that Mokom was in contact with his father Bangui, that also ssona should have been appointed as coordinator and should have been in coordination with Maxime Mokom coordinating things. Para 118 of the brief. No reference is being made by the prosecution, Your Honors, to the contradicting statement of P889, who testified that Maxime Mokom was really upset when ssona was appointed, and that prompted Mokom's return to Bangui. And we all heard evidence that Mr. ssona, while he was trying to seize the anti-Balaka as a resistance movement, Mokom was against. Mokom wanted to continue with the anti-Balaka as resistance movement. It was ssona who in the summer of 2014 said, no, we have to choose a democratic path. There is no anti-Balaka, there is no resistance anymore needed. We have to find a democratic solution. And it was Mokom who went against Mr. ssona. That were the words of the prosecution witnesses. And that, Mr. President, shows the reality of this evidence in court. Your Honors, finally, the prosecution kept repeating during its closing arguments that Mr. ssona was a power-hungry man, driven by self-interest. It also insisted that he had tens of thousands elements at his disposal. Mr. President, ask the chamber, when you go deliberating about this case, ask yourself the question, the simple question. If this was true, if this was the motive of Mr. ssona to return from exile to Bangui, and there sacrificing his life, jeopardizing his life to achieve a democratic solution, Samba Panza. If he was driven by power, hunger for power, and he had tens of thousands of people at his disposal, why didn't he take power with the anti-Balaka? Why? Very simple. In the theory of the prosecution, he should have just winged it with hand, and thousands of people were ready for him to fight. That's their theory. Why didn't he take power? He had the ingredients. In accordance with the prosecution, he had motive. He had the people, tens of thousands of anti-Balaka at his disposal. Ingredients sufficient. No army was there. Why didn't he take power? He chose instead, Mr. President, to support and assist the President Samba Panza. These were also her words when she became a court witness, as the court might recall. He assisted her in stabilizing the country and not taking over power while having the ingredients to do so, and motive. Mr. President, did the phantom of the prosecution I started with come alive in this courtroom? Based upon a fair reading of the evidence, the phantom came not alive. Thank you. I give now the floor to Ms. Giudici.
Thank you, Mr. Knops.
Mr. President, Your Honors, good morning. As Mr. Knops anticipated, this part of our submissions will go into Mr. Ssonna's alleged involvement in the preparation of the 5 December Bangui attack. The prosecution claims Mr. Ssonna was involved in its planning. Yet, a closer look at the evidence it relies on reveals the weakness of its case. Your Honors, you have heard it from counsel of Mr. Yekatom yesterday, and you have heard it from counsel Knops today. So you will not be surprised when I tell you that in the final brief, the prosecution has consistently mischaracterized and embellished testimonial evidence on Mr. Ssonna's alleged contribution to the 5 December attack. For example, the prosecution relies on witness P0954 to show that Mr. Ssonna financed and gave instructions to the anti-Balaka, but omits the witness live evidence, clarifying that this only happened after the Bangui attack. It also relies on P0446 to corroborate the allegation that anti-Balaka would have received the instructions on behalf of Mr. Ssonna during a meeting behind the Ba Obangi Hill. Yet, again, it fails to indicate that P0446 specifically stated during his testimony that he never heard of Mr. Ssonna having provided instructions in that context, and that he has no information about Mr. Ssonna's involvement in the 5 December attack. The prosecution also claims P2673 stated that Mr. Ssonna conveyed an order to Konate to wait before attacking Bangui. What the prosecution doesn't say is that later during his testimony, and consistent with his prior recorded statements, the witness actually corrected himself and said that it was Yambete and not Mr. Ssonna who had conveyed that order. On Monday, you heard the prosecution say that P0992 testified that Mr. Ssonna committed to provide financial assistance to the anti-Balaka before 5 December. Once again, this is misleading. While P0992 did testify that the anti-Balaka approached Mr. Ssonna for financial assistance, he never confirmed that Mr. Ssonna committed to provide it before the attack. The witness actually testified that asking for money is not the same as receiving money. And he did not attempt to recant his testimony as depicted by the prosecution. He simply clarified his answer following defense questioning, which is the whole point of cross-examination. The prosecution also said on Monday that Mr. Ssonna provided money to the participants of the 5 December attack, including P0306. But what about P0306's own evidence that he never received any money from Mr. Ssonna? Again, the prosecution picks and chooses its evidence. It leaves aside P0306 denial of having received financial assistance because it doesn't fit into its case. But it banks on P0306 allegation that Mr. Ssonna was involved in the preparation of the attack. And this is despite the fact that P0306 completely lacked credibility on the stand, fabricated evidence, and had an obvious motive to incriminate Mr. Ssonna. The prosecution is willing to overlook all that as long as it can construe its incriminating narrative. The prosecution is also asking you to speculate, Your Honors, because witnesses stated that Mr. Ssonna informed them of an upcoming attack in Bangui, then he must have been involved in its planning. But with this evidentiary shortcut, Your Honors, the prosecution is turning a blind eye to the established fact that by the end of November, everyone expected the Bangui attack to take place and was exchanging information about it. As P0884 put it, the attack of the elements from the anti-Balaka wasn't something that was secret. Everybody was aware of it. His testimony is consistent with Jotodia's cancellation of the 1st December national celebrations, as well as with the immediate deployment of the Sangaris mission to CAR, which was already operational on the evening of 5 December. Therefore, Mr. Gaisona's awareness of an upcoming attack in Bangui is completely unsurprising and in no way sufficient to establish his involvement in its planning. Faced with such inconclusive testimonial evidence, the prosecution is desperately turning to Facebook conversations to patch up the holes. In doing so, it twists conversation beyond their plain meaning and simply leaves aside those conversations that do not fit into its case theory. The prosecution goes so far as to argue key points on the sole basis of completely unreliable exchanges. Any piece of information, no matter how inconsistent or unreliable, that might vaguely hint at Mr. Gaisona's involvement in the Bangui attack was automatically given credence and a prominent place in the prosecution's brief. The prosecution also spent a large part of its presentation on Monday concerning Mr. Gaisona's criminal responsibility, showing you these conversations. And that is just how much the prosecution's case revolves around what can only be qualified as anonymous hearsay. Your Honors, Mr. Knops already addressed you on the probative value of Facebook conversations. But let me just recall that in most cases, we have not heard the testimony of the authors of these messages. We're therefore completely in the dark as to how they obtained the information they transmitted and whether this information ultimately turned out to be correct or not. And as you will see, I will give you some examples of conversations where information was transmitted and later recounted. These are lucky instances, Your Honors, because they allow us to confirm what we have been saying all along, that information online travels fast and that it often consists of nothing more than rumors and fake news. And I will begin with one example of this. At paragraph 202 of the brief, the prosecution uses Facebook to argue that Mr. Gaisona and Eugène Gaikosé arrived in Yaoundé on 18 and 19 November, respectively, joining a group that would have designated the men to lead the people in Bangui. And you have heard the same argument on Monday. To establish Gaikosé's presence in Cameroon on 18 November, the prosecution relies on a contemporaneous Facebook conversation mentioning that Gaikosé has arrived in Cameroon. What the prosecution fails to say, though, is that the author of this message was later asked, "Which Gaikosé?" To which he candidly responded, "I'm not sure, as you know, there are 4 of them." Your Honors, no factual finding could ever be based on such a conversation. And again, we have been lucky here. What revealed the author's limited knowledge was the recipient seeking for more information. But what if he hadn't? Would that message have been attributed a higher probative value? And for the record, the conversation I just cited is CAR OTP 2102-9800 at pages 9835, 9836. Your Honors, relying on the plain content of these conversations to support any factual allegations is already a disputable choice. But the prosecution doesn't stop at that. In several instances, it adds information to conversation to make sure they fit its theory. And that is how a Facebook message that states, "The boss has called to give instructions," became, "Bozizé called to give the instructions to Ngai ssona and Bernard Mocom." That's paragraph 202 of the brief. Yet there is no indication in that conversation that Mr. Ngai ssona and Bernard Mocom were the recipient of that call. And Webio, who was the author of that passage, was asked about this exchange and could not confirm that Bozizé had called Mr. Ngai ssona at the time. Similarly, a Facebook message stating that Mr. Ngai ssona is at, and I quote, "Douala frontière en mouvement," was interpreted to mean that Mr. Ngai ssona was covering the deployment of troops to the Cameroon-Car border. This is paragraph 203 of the prosecution's brief, but you have heard again the same arguments on Monday. In this case, again, the prosecution's allegations go way beyond the plain meaning of that conversation. And the prosecution is also seeking to reinforce this allegation by claiming that P2673 confirmed that a gathering of military leaders took place in Douala a few days earlier. That is simply not true. A closer look at this conversation shows that P2673 was actually asking his interlocutor to confirm information he had obtained about the presence of leaders in Douala, and that in the end, his interlocutor never confirmed this information. The witness was shown this exchange during testimony and confirmed exactly what the conversation suggests, that this was a rumor and that he could not verify it. The prosecution's eagerness to tie Mr. Ngai ssona to the commission of crimes at all costs even led it to create entirely new arguments concerning supposedly key players of the 5 December attack on the basis of nothing more than unverifiable Facebook chats. At paragraph 203 of its brief, the prosecution highlights a conversation involving Aimé Serefio, stating that Mr. Ngai ssona is with them, and puts it in relation with another message stating that Bernard Mocom contacted Aimé Serefio to coordinate the troops in Bangui. The prosecution is clearly trying to artificially create a connection between Mr. Ngai ssona and this individual who would have been asked to lead the troops in Bangui. Yet, believe it or not, Aimé Serefio does not appear anywhere else in the prosecution's brief, and barely appears in the case record. And I dare say that it would be quite unsound to rely on a sole Facebook exchange in order to determine such a major issue in this case as who coordinated the troops in Bangui. In another instance, the prosecution claims that anti-Balaka elements led by Euseb Mtenou crossed from Zongo to Damara with South African military equipment and the assistance of Francis Bozizé. One would expect for such a claim to be based on a solid array of evidence, including testimonies of insider witnesses. Your Honors, it is not the case. Instead, the prosecution relies on nothing more than a handful inconclusive Facebook messages exchanged by individuals who were not even involved in these events. And when it comes to Francis Bozizé, the prosecution claims he was in permanent contact with Mr. Ngai ssona. They also claimed as such on Monday. Again, this is not substantiated by any testimonial or forensic evidence. Instead, the allegation relies on one Facebook exchange, where two individuals can be seen gossiping and venting their frustration online. the Chamber should not entertain assertions based on such weak evidence. Your Honors, the list of allegations based on nothing more than Facebook conversations goes on. Desperate to show an actual contribution to the Bangui attack, the prosecution takes at face value Facebook exchanges claiming that Mr. Ssona would have ordered the movement of troops. These allegations are absurd. How could Mr. Ssona, a civilian with no experience in military tactics, have been in charge of ordering the movement of troops? But the prosecution does not care for logic or plausibility. It only cares for a conviction. And that is how the allegation that Mr. Ssona and Bernard Mokom asked the anti-Balaka elements in Zongo to cross over to Bangui made it into the prosecution's brief and closing submissions. Never mind if they were elsewhere, and if, as the prosecution told you on Monday, Maxime Mokom was the only one coordinating them. Never mind if the author of that message, D304848, could not vouch for the veracity of that information. As long as it's incriminating, it makes the cut. With even a little help from the prosecution, who dares to claim that D304848 acknowledged the content of the message, despite the fact that, to the contrary, the witness testified that he could not confirm it. And the last, perhaps the most blatant example, Your Honors, the prosecution's allegation that Mr. Ssona ordered the elements in Bouar to reach Bosembele in 3 days on 24 November, which again is based on nothing more than one Facebook conversation. To create the impression of corroboration, the prosecution also points to other messages that seem to hint to the fact that elements in Bouar would have been directed to Bangui. The prosecution even showed you a map on Monday with arrows showing the movement of elements from Bouar to Bosembele to Bangui. What the prosecution doesn't say is that these same Facebook conversations indicate that finally elements did not go from Bouar to Bosembele and then Bangui. And I refer Your Honors to the arguments and Facebook excerpts at paragraph 523 of our brief. The prosecution's banking on this evidence has a clear goal: to show that individuals who allegedly traveled over the car border to Bouar with Mr. Ssona's alleged financial assistance later took part to the Bangui attack. Yet, this is not what these Facebook conversations establish. We ask Your Honors to closely scrutinize them, as not a single one of them ever confirms the arrival of even one of the so-called elements of Bouar in Bangui before 5 December. The prosecution knows it and tries to muddy the waters by claiming that elements from Bosembele and Bouar later took part to the Bangui attack. This is misleading. Several witnesses who descended from Bosangoa testified to have stopped in Bosembele on their way to Bangui. I'm thinking about 2602, 0966, 2251, but the prosecution also argued as such on Monday and in their brief. But, Your Honors, that has no bearing on the issue of whether elements from Bouar also joined the Bangui attack. The prosecution's attempt to mix up these two locations only confirms the weakness of its case. Your Honors, the prosecution has failed to show that any alleged assistance provided to elements in Bouar in any way contributed to the 5 December attack and the commission of crimes on 5 December in general. I will conclude, Your Honors. On Monday, at the end of its presentation on Mr. Ssona's criminal responsibility, the prosecution said that if Mr. Gaisona's name appears in all of these Facebook conversations, that can only mean that somewhat he was involved in these events. This submission says it all. Unable to point to specific and well-substantiated allegations, the prosecution is asking you once more to fill in the voids with speculation. Yet, even taken holistically, these conversations do not even get close to proving Mr. Gaisona's contribution beyond a reasonable doubt. Thank you. And I will give the floor to my colleague.
Thank you, Ms. Giudici. Ms. Beaulieu.
Good morning, Mr. President, Your Honors. I have the privilege to address you today on behalf of Mr. Gaisona. And as mentioned by lead counsel, I will be speaking about the failure from the prosecution to prove the existence of the criminal common purpose pursuant to Article 25(3)(d). Your Honors, the prosecution has set a heavy burden on itself to demonstrate that all anti-Balaka were acting together with the shared objective to target the Muslim civilians population of Kar. And within this common purpose, committed all the crimes Mr. Gaisona is charged with throughout the entire relevant period and across Western Kar. This simply does not reflect the reality, nor account for any nuance. And this is why the theory of the prosecution is flawed. The first flaw in the logic underpinning the prosecution's alleged common purpose is the fact that its theory anchors the origin of the common purpose essentially in speeches of Bozizé and its so-called inner circle before the March coup, and later the alleged inflammatory Muslim rhetoric developed by the Froka. According to the prosecution, this anti-Muslim rhetoric fueled the flame of hatred, and this is what blurred the line between the Seleka combatants and Muslim civilians for the anti-Balaka. And the prosecution told you on Monday that this rhetoric was shared in every single province, and even before the March coup in 2013. Prosecution barely mentioned on Monday that yes, of course, anti-Balaka emerged in response to the atrocities committed by Seleka, but then came back very quickly on multiple occasions on the fact that the anti-Balaka were conflating Seleka and Muslims because of Bozizé inner circle speeches and because of Froka's anti-Muslim rhetoric. Did the prosecution show that, concretely, the speeches galvanized the anti-Muslim resentment among the youth and the non-Muslim civilian population before March 2013? That it contributed to blur the line to a point that Muslim civilians were perceived as the enemy, and that those speeches led to violence in the country after March 2013, months later, and after the Seleka coup? No. The prosecution is asking the court to speculate and to create a false narrative, a narrative that will suit their theory of the criminal common purpose and the intent of the anti-Balaka group. And why do we say that? Because as argued in our closing brief at paragraph 152, if tension rose in Kar around December 2012 and January 2013, it is not because of the speeches that Bozizé made. Rather, it is because of the genuine security threat that was posed by Silica, marching towards Bangui, committing crimes against the civilian population. This is why the population was afraid, and they decided to organize and protest. And the prosecution went as far on Monday as to invoke the comparison that was made by a car local newspaper of a pro-Bozizé program on Radio Centrafrique and the Radio Mille Collines. Your Honors, we all know the content that was broadcasted by the Radio Mille Collines during the Rwanda genocide. This is an extremely grave claim to make that could not be taken lightly. And yet, the prosecution repeats that claim in the courtroom, but fails to support it. When you look at paragraph 34 and footnote 44 of the closing brief of the prosecution, the chamber can see that the prosecution refers to a program by Abakar Picot, Zama, and Femidi. When you look at the transcript of the program, we can read no reference to any anti-Muslim animus. What we can read is references to foreigners coming to the country, towns erect on the passage of the Seleka, political opponents, all legitimate content considering the context. And on a side note, defense witness D4720 testified that Abakar Picot, one of the animators of the same radio program at Radio Centrafrique, was himself a Muslim. It would be surprising that a Muslim would be disseminating phrases that were similar to the one used by the Radio Mille Collines against its own people. In this same footnote, the prosecution also refers to P1847's claim that Javon Papazama was making anti-Silica and anti-jihadist remark. This is not the same as anti-Muslim animus in the context of 2012 and early 2013. I will urge the court to pay close attention to this key part of the prosecution's case that is simply distorting the reality and turning a blind eye on what was happening in CAR in December 2012 and early 2013. And when looking at the FROCA, and I'm referring to our closing brief at paragraph 175 to 196 for more information, you heard defense witness D4720, a FROCA member, who testified that there was never any anti-Muslim discussions that took place during any meetings. The prosecution also did not show how, for instance, Banu Kipa's press release, which according to the prosecution contained anti-Muslim rhetoric, ever reached anti-Balaka elements on the ground. So to argue that those speeches blur the line between the Seleka combatants and the civilian Muslims for the anti-Balaka is a distortion of the reality. And the prosecution needed that to fit in its narrative. This rhetoric is also compounded by a second flaw in the prosecution's theory, which is the lack of credible evidence that the anti-Balaka were targeted Muslim civilians prior to the 5th December. The prosecution makes many shortcuts with the evidence and creates this picture that the anti-Balaka was a homogeneous group attacking the civilian population prior to the 5th December attack. But this picture is simply a smokescreen. First, the prosecution is failing to define the group prior to the 5th December, the anti-Balaka, because it's easier not to account for any nuance and to portray the anti-Balaka as a unified and a homogeneous group. prosecution on Monday argued that the anti-Balaka were a clearly identifiable group. And this is at transcript 306, page 23. And goes on and say that what makes them identifiable is because, and I cite the transcript, they committed search for retribution against silica, and anyone associated with it were perceived to have supported it, and that was the Muslims. But the prosecution stops there and provides no objectively identifiable signs or attribute to the anti-Balaka. So according to the prosecution, anyone engaging in hostilities against the silica or committing acts against the Muslims were becoming anti-Balaka. That was their same distinctive. This is circular reasoning the prosecution is presenting here. Article 25.3d requires that a group of persons, pursuant to a common purpose, commit the crimes. The prosecution cannot only prove the commission of the crime, to identify the group who acted together with the common purpose. This theory is simply a simplification of the reality and is irreconcilable with the evidence that is on the record, and with prosecution witnesses who came testify in court. When taking a closer look, it is apparent that there was no homogeneous group, and this is well summarized in our closing brief at paragraph 228 to 237. And you also have heard, obviously, what my colleagues from the Yekatom team said yesterday, so I won't repeat everything, but I will say that civilians were committing opportunistic acts. Civilians were proclaiming themselves anti-Balaka without having any links with the anti-Balaka. There was faux anti-Balaka, bandits taking advantage of the chaos and the situation. And the prosecution willingly ignores the fact, and this is a major black hole in the prosecution's theory. And we urge the chamber to pay close attention to this fundamental aspect of the reality. Why the prosecution ignores, once again, the reality and its own evidence? Because if they acknowledge that reality, they know that the people committing crimes are not necessarily part of the group of persons driven and acting with a common purpose. And this is a critical element that the prosecution needs to prove to find Mr. ssona liable under Article 25.3d. And the prosecution did not prove that. I will now address you on the lack of common purpose throughout the relevant period, and I will do so in a chronological order. I will start with the action of the anti-Balaka before the 5th December, and the prosecution goes first into the early September attack on Bosangoa and surrounding villages. And this is at paragraph 147 of the prosecution closing brief, and that was also touched upon on Monday. To support their claim that the anti-Balaka were attacking the civilian Muslim population in those villages, the prosecution only relies on newspaper articles. Why? Because the evidence provided by its own witnesses does not play in its favor. Indeed, the prosecution's theory is refuted by P0966, who testified in court that every new recruit in Gobere were informed of the principles to be respected. Do not steal, do not kill civilians. And he himself punished some elements for not respecting those rules. This is also corroborated by P2602 and P2251, saying that the group's objective was not to target civilian Muslims. Your Honor will find our more detailed submissions at paragraph 200. But it shows how the prosecution's case is weak. And when looking now at the alleged anti-Muslim animus shared by the elements deployed at the border, and this is found at paragraph 171 of the prosecution brief. The prosecution argues that P2673 testified that anti-Balaka elements in Garambulai were fueled by anti-Muslim animus and were openly discussing it amongst them. But what did P2673 said? The chamber can see that the witness testified that one anti-Balaka, whose name P2673 was unable to remember, even if he was with him, told him that the anti-Balaka attacked some Muslim. Prosecution should have said one anti-Balaka, not the whole group. In that same footnote, the prosecution is also referring to P0287, a UN expert in this section on the border, who observes, and this is the prosecution citing him, that some lower-rank anti-Balaka were making an association between Seleka, Sudanese, Chadians, and foreigners. They would group them all together as their enemy. The perceived enemy became simply Muslim in general. And this is at footnote 329 of the prosecution's brief. I heard the chamber to go read the statement at paragraph 132 of P287 statement. The shiny quote that the prosecution is using and is rehashing in his closing submissions on Monday is based on an interview with Florent Kema that took place in 2015, as well as with interviews conducted by low-rank anti-Balaka in 2014. No more information on the location or time frame. No link whatsoever with the border. The prosecution is simply, again, using this evidence as it sees fit its narrative, but this is simply not true. As a last remark on the elements of the border, defense witness D4914, who was present at the border as of October 2013, testified that civilians were not the target of the anti-Balaka, but rather the Seleka. And I also quote, "You have to know who your target are. Do not steal. Do not kill civilians. Do not engage in any form of barbaric acts." So this is what I was telling the people each time and every time I could. Looking now at the action of the anti-Balaka during the attacks. Prosecution at paragraph 244 and footnote 495 asserts that despite the fact that the leader's objective was to chase the Seleka, the means they choose entail attacking the Muslim civilian population. When looking more closely at this footnote, the chamber can see that the prosecution is only relying on Rule 68.2 statement, which are untested in court, on the witness statements that were nuanced once the witness testified in court, without acknowledging it, and by relying only on the examination in chief and not on the cross-examination, thus ignoring, again, more nuanced evidence that was given in this court. And again, another example. At its paragraph 330, footnote 680, the prosecutions refer to P0808 statement, who said that the anti-Balaka were targeting Muslims during the attacks of the 5th, at paragraph 40 of its statement. But the prosecution completely ignored to go see the examination in chief that was conducted by defense counsel. And this is at transcript 72, page 14. The witness said, and I quote, "It is difficult for me to say whether it was the anti-Balaka or the civilian population. And that was what caused all the confusion. You can see on the video how people reacting to the situation. So there was chaos. The situation was quite chaotic." This begs the question why the prosecution is not relying on any of its insider witnesses that came to court to testify. Why do they need to rely on P0287, a newspaper article, and untested evidence, when the prosecution, in its own words, called close to 40 insider witnesses, and that much of his case was established by insider witnesses? Another example at paragraph 336 of the prosecution brief, where the prosecution alleged that members, plural, of the so-called inner circle of Bozizé received Facebook messages from correspondents indicating the anti-Muslim animus had been adopted on the ground. The prosecution is misrepresenting the evidence. When you have a closer look at footnote 707 of the prosecution's closing brief, it appears first that all messages cited are correspondence with Lévi Yakité only, not members, plural, of the Bozizé inner circle. However, if we follow the same logic of the prosecution and we look at Facebook messages, we can see that Lévi Yakité was, as early as June 30, 2013, not in line with Bozizé's way of dealing with the situation. And this also crystallized in November 2013 messages stating that Bozizé ne fait plus parler de lui depuis un temps. And the defense has already extensively made submissions in its response to the prosecution's first Facebook BTM that Yakité was not associated with, nor a key figure of the organization of the Anti-Balaka. And second, if you look at the content of the messages, they are either irrelevant, outside of the scope of the charges well after the 5th December. They refer to Chadian or armed Muslims, not civilians. Or they are too unclear to allow to draw any conclusion without speculation. This is the only evidence the prosecution uses to demonstrate that the anti-Muslim animus had spread across the elements and that it was reported to the alleged Bozizé inner circle. The third flaw in the prosecution's theory is the shift after the attack of the 5th December and the departure of Jotodia. Once again, the prosecution's theory is trying to fit the post-September 5th December situation as a simple continuum of that same common purpose shared by the same group. But this is not the case. This simply does not represent the situation. And the prosecution does not account for this change. After the 5th December, there was still Silika and Bangui and hostilities between groups. Witness P808 testify at transcript 72, page 15, that after the 5th December, there was still Silika who continued to kill people in Bangui. Then what happened after the 5th December, and more specifically after Jotodia's departure, is that rogue elements, faux anti-Balaka, and civilians continued to take advantage of the chaotic situation. There was no distinctive, homogeneous, and identifiable group. And when the national coordination was created, the situation was also unclear. Some rogue elements were acting on their own. Some Comzone were following Mr. Ngai ssona. Some Comzone were instructing their elements not to target civilian Muslims. But not all. There was no homogeneity. This is also developed in our closing brief at paragraph 252 to 268. We show that the so-called anti-Balaka movement was deeply fractured, and we have elaborated notably on the Gobere and Bosangua and border elements. And the jurisprudence in the Katanga and the Alassane trial judgment confirmed that an accused cannot be held responsible for opportunistic acts that were not committed pursuant to a common objective shared by a group. P1077 testify as a com zone, it would still have elements who are uncontrollable, who would do all kinds of things, and who would head out and do things not on behalf of the anti-Balaka. For Article 25.3d to be fulfilled, the prosecution must prove that the group is acting together with a common purpose, not some people. And the prosecution is once again misrepresenting the evidence by stating that even after the resignation of Jotodia, Mr. Ngai ssona continued to liaise with the leaders of the anti-Balaka in Karambulai and instructed to launch operation despite the knowledge that the anti-Balaka were sharing an anti-Muslim animus. And the prosecution refers to the January Beloko attack. However, when we look closely at footnote 543, nothing about civilians. All the elements contained in that footnote refers to the attack on Beloko and to one death, the death of General Seleka Suleiman. And again, D4914, when asked about the attack on Beloko in January 2014, clearly testify that the target was only Seleka, not civilian Muslims. And the initiative for peace that the national coordination tried to implement is not a common purpose to target civilian Muslims. And for the prosecution to force a narrative of one group acting with one shared purpose past 10 January is unsupported. And this period will be discussed more in depth by Maître Proce shortly. I will now address the court very quickly on the particularity of the crime of rape that Mr. Ngai ssona is charged with. The prosecution claims that it is common knowledge that armed groups would commit sexual violence against the civilians that are perceived as associated with the opposing party. In the context of the armed conflict in Car between 2003 and 2015. The trial chamber in Getanga trial judgment reminded us at paragraph 1630 that for the chamber to be satisfied that the perpetrator's acts were within the common purpose, it is necessary to show that the crime form part of this common purpose. Crimes ensuing solely from opportunistic acts by members of the group, but which fall out with the common purpose, cannot be attributed to the group's concerted action. I don't intend to repeat what is already in our closing brief at paragraph 271 to 276, but there's 2 points that must be made in response to the prosecution and also to the legal representative of victims' closing brief. First, the prosecution relies on general documents containing sexual violence to establish that there was a common knowledge that sexual violence would be committed by the parties of the armed conflict in Car, because there was a certain atmosphere favorable to gender-based violence recognized by the Car government. This could not be more vague. This is not evidence that established that anti-Balaka were sharing the common objective to commit sexual violence against Muslim civilians. Second, the prosecution refers to the FIDH report CAR-OTP-2001-2769, and which only refers specifically to rape committed by Seleka elements. And this is the same story in all the documents in the prosecution sexual gender-based violence bar table motion that is cited, again, in the prosecution's closing brief at footnote 662. Effectively, the prosecution is attempting to attribute the crimes committed by the Seleka to the anti-Balaka. And third, the prosecution also cites to the Bemba case The Bemba case proceeded in front of this court for facts dating back 2003. This is the evidence the prosecution has presented to prove that sexual violence was part of the common purpose of the Antibalaka. The prosecution is asking the court to convict Mr. Ngai ssona on the basis of a common knowledge that sexual violence is widespread in armed conflict, on the basis of another case that took place in Car in 2003, and on the rapes that were committed by the Silica elements. But this is simply not how criminal liability works. And again, the prosecution seems to disregard the jurisprudence from this court, especially the Katanga case. And at paragraph 1663 of the trial judgment states that although rape has been committed against civilian women by Ngiti combatants, there was no evidence laid before the court to allow it to find that the acts of rape and enslavement were committed on a wide scale and repeatedly during the Bogoro attack, or the attack of Bogoro would inevitably entail the commission of such acts, nor that the Ngiti combatant, prior to this battle, had committed crimes of sexual violence. This is the same case at end. Even if the chamber was to find that 1 or 2 rapes were committed in Bosangwa, no pattern was established by the prosecution, and they simply failed to establish that the crime of rape was within the Antibalaka common purpose. The chamber should also disregard the CLRV claim that this one incident of rape is not an isolated incident, given that at least 30% of participating victims related that in their application form, they suffered sexual violence. Your Honors, the information provided in victims' application form is not evidence. The application form are administrative in nature, and this is well established by the jurisprudence of this court in the Bemba case. And I will not come back on the points that were made by my colleague yesterday about the victims' participation form and their credibility in this case. So as a conclusion, this chamber cannot safely conclude that the Antibalaka was a movement acting together with a common purpose to commit all of the charged crime against Mr. Ngai ssona. And this concludes my remark for today. And I will leave it to you for the rest of the session.
Well, I understand why you say that. We have 10 minutes to 1 o'clock. Ms. Prue, I think, would be next. Is this correct? I suggest that we have the lunch break until 2 o'clock and you start fresh and anew. Yeah. Lunch break until 2 o'clock.
All right, veuillez vous lever.